The following video is part of an educational series of meth prevention educational training videos. These videos were produced by MAP South Dakota, a project of Prairie View Prevention Services.
Production and duplication costs for this video were provided by Sanford Children's, Child's Voice, Siouxland Child Protection Council, and the Child Advocacy Centers of South Dakota.
I had been using meth for about a year prior to becoming pregnant with Marcus, and continued to use. I had Marcus on Christmas Day. Child Protection Services had visited me in the hospital and asked for a release of information to test myself and the baby for substance abuse because I was undergoing an investigation for a drug possession charge. I signed the release papers. When I went home from the hospital, I noticed that Marcus would just cry and cry for hours at a time sometimes, and there was just no way to comfort him. I'd just hold him in my lap, and he just wouldn't stop crying. And probably when he was about 4 to 6 weeks old, I started noticing the shudders, like the tremors, because I kept him wrapped up in a blanket real tight, and then he'd be crying and all of a sudden just kind of shake and just cry and shake. And his older brother Deontay kind of sat with him most of the time, because by that time, by 6 weeks after having Marcus, I had started using again. And he took care of him most of the time, and Marcus kind of had problems digesting his milk and things. He would just like puke it out way far away. And so I kept taking him to the doctor to get those things taken care of or whatever. Meanwhile, I was still using.
Methamphetamine use prenatally is currently it's being studied to understand the effects of prenatal exposure. We know that methamphetamine use in pregnancy does get to the baby through the placenta. The level that gets to the baby is probably, at least in some studies, is suggested as high as it is in the mom, and it may remain in fetal circulation longer. It's entirely dependent on how healthy mom's body is, how well the baby does. So if mom has been using for a long time and has, for example, kidney or liver effects, that is going to affect the baby. Mom's nutrition is going to affect the baby. The fact that methamphetamine is a vasoconstrictor and constricts the vessels that feed the baby through the placenta is important. So oftentimes those placentas aren't healthy. Oftentimes the placenta may be small, and consequently the baby may be smaller than an average-sized baby. As far as outcomes when the babies are born, at this point there is no methamphetamine exposure syndrome defined as there is for fetal alcohol exposure. We still understand that the worst drug of abuse for a mom to use while she's pregnant is alcohol. But we do know that the meth does get to the baby, and it's unclear at this time whether the brain effects we see in the adult user may be effects that we see in the baby. It's unclear, and we're very early in our studies. So it's hard to know what that long-term impact may be, both on the brain and on the baby's body. Things we do see at this point is sometimes these babies are smaller. Sometimes these babies may have some systemic problems that probably relates to when in the pregnancy mom used. If she used the day that the heart was doing a lot of developing, it's possible there could be a heart problem. But there's no defined set of abnormalities other than the smaller babies. When the babies are born, again, some of the babies may look actually okay. However, there is one study that suggests about 50% of babies born meth-exposed had some kind of withdrawal symptoms, and about 4% actually had withdrawal symptoms enough to require medications. The things that we might see if we're going to see a baby be symptomatic after exposure prenatally to meth, we may see a baby that initially looks somewhat sleepy. So much like the user who is using for days and then crashes because their brains become completely depleted of the dopamine until that brain regenerates the dopamine and they wake up, the babies may be having the same effect. They may have dopamine depletion in their brain. They may become sleepy. They may essentially crash. And then after the first several days to several weeks, now they become like a cocaine-exposed baby oftentimes is, irritable, fussy, jittery, shrill cry, stiff, perceived to not be wanted to be held, especially by a parent who's got some substance abuse issues. And that's a real concern, because in that period, as opposed to the initial period where maybe they weren't even getting fed because they weren't crying and waking up to be fed, and unfortunately that's a risk because you have a home where people aren't eating normally themselves, because folks that are using for days don't eat, don't sleep, okay? Now you have a baby who, after that first few weeks, is now irritable and crying a lot, doesn't self-regulate well. So if someone comes in and out of the house, it maybe stimulates them, upsets them, they don't self-quiet. And so that's a real risk for abuse in those children.
You know, at the center, we're seeing more and more children that are being drug exposed to a number of things, but the most common thing now is methamphetamine. We're seeing more and more. The numbers are going up literally almost every month. We will see them mostly because they end up in foster care very quickly, because they are taken out of the homes where they're being exposed to the drugs. And so we provide a service to the community where we see all the children in the community who go into foster care. So we see them as soon as we can when they get into foster care, and then we provide a complete evaluation medically for them. And again, those numbers are only going up in the community.
Meth is the worst thing that ever happened to me and my family. And when I pulled up to my apartment, there was like 5 or 6 cop cars, and so I drove off and went to Burger Time. And I thought I'd grab the food and then go back and see. Hopefully it wasn't me. Hopefully it wasn't something that was going to happen to me. You know, hopefully it was somebody else in the apartment building. Well, I went into Burger Time. A police officer cornered me, told me to get out of the car. The other police officer pulled up, took the baby out of the car. I didn't know really what was happening until the lady was like, you know, are you high on meth right now? And I said, no, I'm not. And she said, well, we have this court order to place your children in the state's custody. And so they took my children away that day. Definitely is the worst thing that ever happened to me.
We've been foster parents since 1999, and our first placement was a sibling group of 2, and we've been able to keep them. We've had 18 children in and through our home. We've had 14 foster respite cases, so a total of 32. And what brought us into foster care was Dana thought it was very important that I stay home from work, but our kids were already 8 and 13, and we knew that there was need in the community for foster parents. And my grandma was also a foster parent, and that was something in my history that it was always an exciting time when Grandma would come to visit and she'd bring these little babies, and I knew that that was something that I'd like to do when I grew up. When Marcus came into our care, we weren't aware that there was any meth immediately at that time. And we did notice that he had respiratory problems when he came into care. And within a series of events, taking him to the doctor constantly, it was confirmed that Mom said that at birth he had these respiratory problems, breathing problems, just a noisy breather. Later we found out that she had been doing meth in the home and that she was doing meth during pregnancy. And that became a concern to us, but we didn't have any experience with meth prior to that. After hearing that, when he was 4 or 5 months old, we'd noticed that he would arch his back and do things that just weren't normal for a child that age, and we did watch that. It did go away on its own, whether it was meth related or not. I guess we haven't confirmed that.
Now we're kind of searching. We want to find out more because obviously we have concern with our children in our home that we can take care of them without bringing other children in and you know, putting them at risk because of, you know, the product or the meth being in their clothes or, you know, in their blanket or whatever, like we talked about.
What we're seeing is that these children are really quite neglected. I mean, these drug-endangered children or drug-exposed children are almost 100% of the time they show signs of neglect, whether it's physical neglect, emotional neglect. They are really developmentally behind their peers. If they are school age, they're really behind their peers in school. Preschoolers are just really developmentally delayed with their language, their muscle skills, their motor skills, we call them. They're usually in great need of seeing a dentist. That has been significantly neglected. They've usually been neglected medically in the sense that their shots are way behind or they haven't had any of their routine immunizations. So really that's kind of what we see the most when we see these children.
It's amazing how prevalent this is getting. I mean, it's sad that we even have to, worry about children coming in our home that might be exposed to meth. These kids that go through enough as it is with neglect and abuse, and now on top of it they could, be affected by the actual uses of meth on top of that. That's a pretty sad state of affairs.
The video you have just watched is one of a series of meth prevention training videos produced by MAP South Dakota, a project of Prairie View Prevention Services.
Production and duplication costs for this video were provided by Sanford Children's, Siouxland Child Protection Council, and the Child Advocacy Centers of South Dakota, including Child's Voice, Children's Safe Place, Child Advocacy Center of the Black Hills, Central South Dakota Child Assessment Center, and Oglala Lakota CASA, CAC.
To learn more about how you can become involved in this effort, visit mapsouthdakota.org or call 800-343-9272. These videos are made possible by a U.S. Department of Justice grant.